Congress wanted to mine for zinc, asbestos, and copper and timber, a lot of places Roosevelt wanted to save. Most spectacularly, the Grand Canyon. And Roosevelt went to the Grand Canyon with the Rough Riders, the volunteers that served with him in the Spanish-American War, surrounded him. Colonel Roosevelt, the war hero, so he had basically his guys from the military behind him. And he stands at the canyon and says, "Do not touch it. God has made it. You will only mar it. Leave the Grand Canyon alone."
I want to quickly now move towards Mr. Doug Brinkley, who has kindly joined us today to talk about the history of environmental presidents. And Doug, I just want to thank you for coming all the way from Texas. I know you're a busy man, and also for your great body of work. The books that you've written are quite extraordinary. Welcome to the AREDAY stage. Douglas Brinkley.
Good morning. Thank you for getting up this early on a Sunday for who's ever here. It's in many ways an exercise in positivity to be given a half an hour to talk about successful presidents in conservation and environment, because a lot weren't. So by nature, cherry picking these winning figures skews the deck a little bit. But the truth of the matter is, when you teach environmental policy, and particularly look at presidents, you can deal with Thomas Jefferson somewhat. He was really a great devotee of North American flora and fauna and Europe. George Washington knew something about botany. Benjamin Harrison actually started creating our national forest reserves. But the whole idea of conservation or environmentalism begins with Theodore Roosevelt. And TR was born in 1858 in New York City. And what does that first off tell you? The Civil War is part of his childhood. He had a mother, the Bullocks from Georgia, who were for the Confederates. Theodore Roosevelt's father was an ardent Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant man, didn't serve in the war. He hired a surrogate to serve in his place. And then the big thing in the Roosevelt family was when TR was 1 year old, a revolution came. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species. And while our soldiers were dying at Shiloh or Chickamauga or Gettysburg, very few people were talking about Darwin's theory of evolution, but the Roosevelt family was. And they were because TR's father founded the American Museum of Natural History in New York. They were trying to build it and make it better than the British Museum. And they were Darwin drunk. TR's father believed in Darwin. Theodore Roosevelt's uncle, Robert Barnwell Roosevelt, was a Darwinian zoologist at Harvard who wrote a book on Lake Superior, who wrote a book about waterfowl of Florida, and was considered the top frog specialist. It's his uncle who lived a block from where TR grew up in New York City. And so while Dad was building the big museum in New York, young Theodore Roosevelt started collecting birds' nests. He started doing taxidermy with the last teacher of the John James Audubon, taking the arsenic and weaving it and making his own collection. If you went to the American Museum of Natural History in New York, you can take it and see the drawers of all the birds that are tagged that Theodore Roosevelt had shot and stuffed. It might seem cruel or an unusual beginning for an incredible naturalist, but in those days, without DNA, without anybody knowing about DNA, without bird banding, without radar, if you wanted to study a bird, you killed it. And you did it because you were studying beak variations or colorations, and the big thing was what's a species and what's a subspecies, and how many types of bluebirds are there in North America in order to fill our proper guidebooks. TR fell under the spell, declared he wanted to be a naturalist, goes to Harvard University, majors in naturalist studies. Essentially, he wanted to be a wildlife biologist. He has epiphanies at Harvard, mainly dealing with Henry David Thoreau, not just Walden Pond or Cape Cod, but he would go up to Maine, to Mount Katahdin, and trace TR, the exact route that Henry David Thoreau went. This all culminates this interest in TR writing as an undergraduate his first book, The Summer Birds of the Adirondacks. What's important about Theodore Roosevelt is that he believed clean air, clean water, or the natural world writ large had beneficial health. It would help your health. He had chronic asthma. He was sick when he was in New York City. It was deeply polluted. His father actually was really the leader of the SPCA, because when in those days you could just shoot a dog or a cat in the mud streets of New York, and there became a humane movement that was loosely connected to what becomes conservation in a way. And so Theodore Roosevelt's off and running. He will have his big moment is when he goes into the legislature of New York and gets a telegram message on the exact same day Theodore Roosevelt's mother dies and his wife dies giving childbirth. You can go to the home. He was spending the night of Valentine's Day shuttling between floors with both sick, and we read people's leavings for living historians, so that letters, diaries. One of the most moving I've ever seen is Theodore Roosevelt's giant X through his diary, because you could almost see the pen cutting the paper. And he writes under it that the light has gone out of my life forever. Theodore Roosevelt's family had issues of depression. His brother committed suicide, jumping out of a window, alcohol and drugs related. Theodore Roosevelt's sister said, look, go, after the dual burial in Wall Street in a cemetery, a mother and wife, she told him, go west. The happiest young Theodore Roosevelt ever been is when he went way out to Carroll County, Iowa, to go grouse hunting, and he was reading Francis Parkman's On the Oregon Trail, and he put a buffalo robe around himself, and he felt like he was part of the West. And so he took the Northern Pacific, and some people don't realize, building those, you hear about gold spike ceremonies, but the railroads or cross-continental ones are built from the east, west, and they meet somewhere in between. He simply took the Northern Pacific and got off where the tracks left him with a duffel bag, a rifle, and his called pigskin library of books, anything Darwin ever wrote in particular. And he spent time in the Badlands of North Dakota, and there we call it the cradle of conservation, because while he was there, he came up with a lot of the concepts of how we had to save our country from ruin, from over-timbering, over-harvesting, from bad soil policies, and most to his heart, we are exterminating wildlife. He went to go hunt a buffalo. There used to be 60 million buffalo on the Great Plains, 60 million. I just saw, I'm going to go visit it, Illinois, so it has a new, they're reintroducing buffalo right now to Illinois to their rightful range. Some citizens are doing some good mammal, restoration work. But he couldn't believe that he had money, he hired the best guides, and they still couldn't find one in the Dakota territories. It took a week. He finally shot one. They ate the hump and the tongue, which people would do back then. Those were the delicacies, and he sent the head to Sagamore Hill, his home in Long Island, where you can go see it today, the big bison head. That would be a hunting story, except Theodore Roosevelt, out of that, goes back, creates the Boone and Crockett Club of hunters wanting to save species in peril, particularly deer, elk, buffalo, or bison, and he wanted to he created the American Bison Association. As president, Theodore Roosevelt put the bison on the nickel, buffalo nickel. as president, he ripped out the furnishings in the White House that had lion heads, giraffes, and things because they weren't indigenous to North America. And he then works personally with a zoologist extraordinaire at the Bronx Zoo in New York to raise a genetically perfect herd of buffalo, which is hard to do because their stomachs have a certain amount of grass. This is up in New York. They eventually get a herd, like 17, healthy, and he then gets a railroad car that's cushioned as if it's for racehorses and brings it down to Wichita Mountain in Oklahoma. And with the Comanche chief, Kowana Parker, they release the buffalo there, and it begins really the restoration of bison in the United States, to the point where, and this is, you could see the closeness in this thinking to Ted Turner on some of his view of the importance of the bison to American psyche and life. Roosevelt goes on and defines conservation. From 1901 to 1909, when he's president, he puts aside about 230 million acres of public lands. Roosevelt's idea is that every city, a community like Boulder, say, needs to have massive green belts protected around them. He did not trust hyper-industrialization. He thought smaller cities with a lot of green belt was the best way for the United States to go. And how do you save that much land? Well, he did it by all sorts of mechanisms. He invented how to save land. One that was there for him was national parks. But national parks, you have to go through Congress. And he got those through. If you go to, Mesa Verde here in Colorado, that's a TR National Park, or Crater Lake in Oregon, or Wind Cave in South Dakota. They're parks. But Congress wanted to mine for zinc, asbestos, and copper and timber, a lot of places Roosevelt wanted to save. Most spectacularly, the Grand Canyon. And Roosevelt went to the Grand Canyon with the Rough Riders, the volunteers that served with him in the Spanish-American War, surrounded him. Colonel Roosevelt, the war hero, so he had basically his guys from the military behind him. And he stands at the canyon and says, "Do not touch it. God has made it. You will only mar it. Leave the Grand Canyon alone." Senate's moving to mine it. They don't want it as a national park. It gets rejected. Roosevelt cleverly finds an elastic piece of legislation, the Antiquities Act of 1906, which a Congressman, Lacey from Iowa, developed because people from Europe were coming to the West and stealing our dinosaur bones. We didn't have the paleontologists at these dig sites of today. The Europeans were ahead of us, realizing they're of value, and at the same time, they were looting Native American kivas or Hopi sites, bringing those relics to Europe, to Stockholm, to Berlin, to Paris. And so the Antiquities Act was, if you want to think of it, like a yellow plastic of a site, today, where you put it around an acre maybe. So the federal government, on the name of science, would declare that land, that acre or 2 acres, belonging to the American people in the name of science. Roosevelt takes that obscure piece of legislation and applies it to the entire Grand Canyon, 1 million acres. And when people challenge it, he says, "It is science. Show me a better way to study erosion at work." And he gets sued for saving the Grand Canyon. It goes to the courts, and TR wins. And without that win, we would not have the heirlooms that we have in our country today. He started signing national monuments with executive order after executive order. The redwood trees, Muir Woods in California, Devil's Tower in Wyoming. I could go on and on. The list is long of his monuments. So that's the executive power and monuments. Second thing TR did. Everybody here, we all own 550 national wildlife refuges today. How does that happen? How does our country develop 550 national wildlife refuges? Starts with Theodore Roosevelt. He found out, if any of you came to hear me talk on a Sunday 100 years ago, certainly 115 years ago, all the women here would have been wearing a bonnet with an ornamental feather. It was the fashion style, and there was a feather mafia that was killing birds. And what you would do, the bison were slaughtered because the railroad companies didn't like them, because you don't want to run in a train into a herd of buffalo, you lose your property. Telegraph companies were an enemy of the buffalo because they like to rub their backs on the post, and it's a ton knocking over the whole telegraph. The army tried to destroy them because they were taking away the food substance of native people. So it had enemies. The birds' enemies were fashion mafia, because the birds, what good does not having federal law do? If Massachusetts Audubon's going to be very active in Massachusetts, only for them to fly to Florida and be shot willy-nilly to be plucked for a feather. And these birds, rookeries, were often offshore, and they would just flap their wings for a predator to come. But people were coming in with guns, slaughtering them all, taking the eggs, taking it, and they were species going extinct. And Roosevelt finds out about a place called Pelican Island in Florida. I recommend you visit it. There is a plank for on a boardwalk to an estuary there, where every national wildlife refuge we created is represented. Roosevelt talked to lawyers in his White House and said, what will stop me from declaring this whole part of Florida a federal bird reservation? The lawyers hummed and hawed, and Roosevelt, with his fist, as he would tend to do, said, I so declare it. And Pelican Island became our first national wildlife refuge. He then created 51. The Yukon Delta of today is the size of West Virginia. He did it all over to start. And these wildlife refuges weren't for people to have tourism. They were deeded to species to have places, sanctuaries, to breed and thrive. I can go on with TR stories all day, and why the teddy bear was a symbol, but there's never been a president like him that really would, on any given night, Roosevelt would invite you guys to the White House. He loved talking about anything to do with what today we call environmentalism. And of course, with Gifford Pinchot, he created the modern U.S. Forest Service, wise use conservation. But Roosevelt found out that 150 if you pull out a map, 150 of your western national forests were not going to be national forest. Roosevelt found out what the vote would be in Congress and usurped them by declaring them on one day, on a hot July day, all of them in one swoop national forest. So we're really living in North America off a TR grid. After Roosevelt, we have a second great environmental president, FDR. Underrated. If you want to understand FDR, you have to see his connection to his fifth cousin, Theodore. Theodore Roosevelt was from New York. FDR's from New York. Theodore Roosevelt was a state legislator. FDR's a state legislator. Theodore Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. FDR's Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Theodore Roosevelt is governor of New York. FDR's governor of New York. Theodore Roosevelt loves the big Navy. FDR loves big Navy. Theodore Roosevelt puts conservation number one. FDR puts conservation number one. They only deviate, but TR prefers scientific forestry, while FDR preferred scientific forestry, while TR preferred wildlife. But the net effect is when the stories of FDR born on the Hudson, buried on the Hudson, loved New York. We know the Hudson landscape painters and all of that beauty of the Hudson River. And Eleanor Roosevelt would say, if my husband has a map mind and he knows every bush, rock, nook, and cranny of his district in upstate New York, Dutchess County, where he represented people. But the main thing I wanted to part you with, he became a leader in the 1920s when we had 3 anti-conservation presidents. I mean, really anti it. Taft, and it was so. But after Woodrow Wilson, you get the disasters of Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover. And Roosevelt, in that decade of the 20s, he got polio. He couldn't walk. He bought a polio resort in Warm Springs, Georgia, and was just going to live with the polios, because when you got polio, nobody wanted to see you. You thought you would get it from being in the airspace. So he was a forgotten figure at this point, FDR, and his big passion was state parks. But he comes back, and I don't have the time to tell the great story of how he did it, but he does come back at the right time in New York and wins the governorship in 1928. It used to be every 2 years in New York, then 1930. And as you all know, in 1932, with the New Deal, he's president and gives that amazing speech in March of 1933 where, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. And then he does the first New Deal measure, the Civilian Conservation Corps, to try to fix the damaged landscape of America. We had clear-cut all the hardwood trees in Ohio and Indiana. We have drained all the wetlands. We were treating swamps as dump yards. We had the Dust Bowl in the middle part of the country. It was a wreck. And Roosevelt CCC took unemployed people and gave them $1 a day. And they often would be taken from an urban center, let's say Philadelphia, and brought out to Wyoming or Colorado. And between 1933 and 1942, with World War II, stopped it. But they planted nearly 3 billion trees, the CCC. They also built bird flyways, and the government bought for cheap land and restored it for habitat under Roosevelt. And guess how many, guys, state parks are created with the help of the Roosevelt administration during his presidency? 800 state parks. Can you see what the two Roosevelts did and what we owe them? We've been living off of it. And he did a lot of the iconic parks, obviously, and all too. I mean, Channel Islands and Mammoth Cave and Olympic Forest, and it's an endless list. If Isle Royal up in Michigan. The next presidents, there's not any quite like them, but I'm going to rattle off the other winners, so to speak, in a ranking, and these aren't in particular order, although I would put TR first, FDR second. John F. Kennedy's a surprising environmental president. It's because he connected with William O. Douglas, the Supreme Court Justice, who was his father's great friend. And Bill Douglas from Yakima, Washington, would hike. In fact, in the 1950s, he hiked 186 miles from Georgetown to Cumberland, Maryland, to save the C&O Canal. And Justice Douglas, during the 60s, would join the Sierra Club and other organizations as justice, and he never lost a protest march, meaning he went to the Buffalo River in Arkansas in a canoe to get it saved as a wild and scenic river. He went into Kentucky to stop a dam and save a gorge there. He went into Illinois and did the same. He'd hike with the Kennedy family in Washington State to protect the Pacific coast of the strip of Olympic Park, so roads didn't ruin it. And he continued the Wilderness Society idea of pushing for roadless wilderness. The first real wilderness site in the United States, true one in a government way. Some will say Gila, down in Arizona, but the one that's dramatic and important is what is today Kings Canyon National Park in California. Because a young unknown photographer, Ansel Adams, had taken a portfolio of photos of that area. And Harold Ickes, the Interior Secretary, found out about him. He went to a Bohemian Grove meeting in San Francisco, and somebody showed him the photos. He then brought at that point, Ansel Adams to Washington, D.C. to meet FDR, because Eleanor said, if you want my husband to save something, show him pretty pictures. I find it true over and over again. And in this case, he went and sat with Ansel Adams to, oh my God, look at that shot. And you all know how beautiful Ansel Adams' photography is, so you would have been impressed too. Anybody would. And Roosevelt, what do we have to do? And they said, well, we want to do it as wilderness, no roads, big California wilderness. And then Roosevelt said the question that's heartbreaking. He said, well, then I'll never be able to see it because he's in a wheelchair. And if it doesn't have those vistas and roads, he can't enjoy the scenery. And they all like paused for a minute. He said, let's do it. And they create it as a wilderness. Same time, within weeks later, a woman named Mervana Hamilton Hoyt, who used to run the Pasadena Rose, parade and more there, horticulturist and socialite and philanthropist, but Eleanor told her to go see her husband with pictures, and she brought all the Joshua trees. They were considered scrub Joshua trees. Nobody thought they were worth saving. Desert scrub trees. And she had these beautiful photos of the whole area there around Palm Springs, and he puts 1 million acres of that area of Joshua Tree as a national monument using executive power. She was so shocked, she couldn't believe she got what she wanted. And she said to Roosevelt, well, look, the only problem is the train has this lease through it, and this company owns that. And Roosevelt said, we got lawyers, we'll get rid of them all. It's a different way of doing things in conservation than you can do today. And so Bill Douglas is the real link in the 50s, and he told young Jack Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy would go hiking with Bill Douglas all the time. If you wonder why RFK Jr. became an environmentalist, because of Bill Douglas and his father, they hiked all over Siberia together, Robert F. Kennedy and William O. Douglas. But he said to Jack Kennedy, not Bobby. Bobby always loved the outdoor world. But he said to Jack, problem is with you, Jack, you've never slept on the ground. And he said, so we got to get you into something. You got to own something in what today's environmentalism. And they decided it would be seashore preservation. And true to his word, John F. Kennedy, as president, is the leader to create Cape Cod National Seashore, Point Reyes up in Marin, California National Seashore, Padre Island in California. It is hard to create. Our shorelines are our most valuable real estate. And you're going to try to save it like Kennedy era did. It's tough, and they did it. And that seashore, saving our shores mission, then became lake shores. And continues under Kennedy and Johnson. They then focus on the Great Lakes and save Sleeping Bear Dunes National Monument, beautiful up there by Traverse City. Picture Rock on the Upper Peninsula, the Indiana Dunes between Chicago and Gary, Apostle Islands, 22 islands in Wisconsin. This is all this Kennedy-Johnson effort to save seashores. And of course, in 1964, the Wilderness Act passed. Lyndon Johnson signs it into being and puts aside 9.1 million acres of roadless wilderness. What I discovered, guys, of this period, which I just wrote a book all about, and David Brower was the best guide for this, is what they did well under Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, who I'll mention in a minute, is win. They had win after win after win. After they stopped the Dinosaur National Monument from being desecrated, Colorado, in the 50s, everybody pitched in. It could be a Republican like Walt Disney doing television programs. It could be Jacques Cousteau, Underseas. It was Rachel Carson writing 3 books about sea life, and then her killer book in 1962 about DDT poisoning and pesticides, which brought these coalitions together because Rachel Carson's delivering public health. And it's really the birth of environmentalism with her book in 62. The real first group that does well as environmental fighters is the Environmental Defense Fund in 1967 out of Long Island under the motto, "Sue the Bastards." But Kennedy is underappreciated for other things he did, but he loved the seashore, and that was his Walden. Yeah, students, I could ask you guys, what's your Walden? What place in the natural world has touched you and speaks to you? And if you have that, you're more willing to understand the connection between human life and why we have to do preservation and protect the beauty of our country and the planet. But then Lyndon, nobody knew what to take of Lyndon Johnson. He had not been a great conservationist senator. He liked every dam, but he married Lady Bird. And Lady Bird Johnson, with wildflowers and billboards and clean highways, and they pour through the winds. It's tragic because our country is doing all this great environmental work out of the White House in the 60s while we're bombing people in Vietnam and using Agent Orange and killing vegetation. At the same time, Lyndon Johnson's creating Redwood National Park with Lady Bird in California. He's creating the North Cascades, a big win up there in Washington State, Canyonlands in Utah, much, much more, gives us environmental quality. And then the last, the other two presidents that deserve mention, and then I'm going to have my clock is running out. I will just say Richard Nixon surprised me. He came in as president only days with the Santa Barbara oil spill. And he saw the public outrage. And then in the summer of '69, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were on the moon, the Cuyahoga River caught fire. And the media was ginned up about this stuff. And he decided he was going to triangulate, just like he did going to China in '72. Nixon tries to out-environment the environmental Democrats. And he signs on January 1st, 1970, at San Clemente, the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, which puts forces in impact statements and also gives real birth to environmental law all over the country because every company has to have an environmental lawyer. Nixon will go on and push for the Clean Air Act of 1970 and sign it. We're living off it today by and large. Clean Water Act, he does national recreation areas like Golden Gate in California and Gateway in California. And I'll end on Nixon. And hopefully we may be able to talk about Carter because he's still with us in our next session. But do you realize, guys, right now, the Yom Kippur War was 50 years ago. Right now, Hamas and Israel are at war. Exactly 50 years ago, at this time, the Arab oil embargo kicked in because of that. And that's when the environmental movement started losing gas. All those wins, because another team's anti-environmental started building forces. And that group includes the birth of American Enterprise, the Heritage Foundation, the Federalist Society, the Koch brothers. It becomes a buildup to stop the government from federal regulation because Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency out of the White House in the summer of 1970 after the successful first Earth Day. But 50 years ago, as I'm standing here, Senate passed the Endangered Species Act, which had TR's ancient fingerprints all over it. And guess what it passed? 92-0. It's because our country was going at the saving of the environment from every angle, and it became a true movement with Rachel Carson and as the spearhead of it all. Thank you, guys.